I woke up to the sound of a truck engine rumbling outside my window, followed by the unmistakable slosh of something thick and wet being poured onto the ground. My brain, still tangled in the fog of sleep, hadn't fully caught up yet, but my gut told me something was very, very wrong. I threw on a pair of sweatpants and rushed to the door, only to stop dead in my tracks the moment I stepped outside. My driveway, my freshly paved, smooth blacktop driveway, was completely covered in wet cement. Thick, gray, and heavy, it oozed over the pavement like an unholy flood, swallowing everything in its path. My car was trapped, the path to my house was buried, and standing across the street, holding a coffee cup in one hand and her phone in the other, was Margaret, smirking. I felt my eye twitch. "Margaret!" I yelled, storming across my front yard, my bare feet sinking into the damp grass. "What the hell did you do to my driveway?" Margaret took a slow, deliberate sip of her coffee, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," she said. "I did you a favor. Your driveway was an eyesore. I assumed you were going to redo it, so I went ahead and got you started." I blinked at her, trying to process the sheer audacity of her words. "You." I sucked in a sharp breath, my fists clenching at my sides. "This is private property. You can't just dump cement on someone's driveway." Margaret shrugged. "Well, actually, I can. According to the HOA bylaws, all driveways must be uniform in appearance. You didn't file the proper paperwork for your little renovation, which means your driveway was in violation. And as the acting head of the HOA, I took the liberty of correcting it." My nostrils flared. "Margaret, I don't even live in an HOA." "Oh, you do now," she said, flashing me a sickly sweet smile. "I started one last week." Surprise. I wanted to strangle her right there in broad daylight, with all the neighbors watching, because of course they were watching. A few of them stood on their porches, whispering among themselves, but none of them dared to step in. No one ever did. This was Margaret's kingdom, and in her mind, we were all just lucky to exist in it. I turned back to my driveway, where the cement was already beginning to set. My car, a perfectly good sedan, was now partially submerged in a sea of solidifying concrete. My blood pressure skyrocketed. "You're paying for this," I growled, jabbing a finger in her direction. "Every single cent." Margaret laughed. "Oh, honey," she said, waving her phone at me. "I recorded everything. And guess what? I sent it to the HOA board. They all agree with me." I stared at her, my mind a whirlwind of rage and disbelief. This woman, this absolute menace, had just destroyed my driveway, trapped my car, and was acting like she had done me a public service. A car honked from down the street. Margaret's husband, a spineless man who always scurried away at the first sign of conflict, was sitting in the driver's seat of their brand-new luxury SUV. She waved at him, then turned back to me with a smug grin. "I'd love to stay and chat, but I have a very important hair appointment. I hope you enjoy your new driveway, Jake." And with that, she sauntered off, climbed into her car, and drove away, completely oblivious to the level of destruction she had just caused. I stood there for a long moment, my hands trembling at my sides. The cement reeked of chemicals, and the sun was already baking it into a thick, unbreakable crust. My neighbors were still whispering behind their hands, too afraid to cross Margaret. But I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. If Margaret wanted war, she was about to get one. An hour later, I sat on my porch, staring at the disaster zone that used to be my driveway. The cement had hardened enough that there was no easy way to remove it without hiring an expensive team of professionals. My car was ruined, and the cost of getting it out alone would drain my savings. My best friend since college, Chris, pulled up to my house and let out a long, low whistle as he stepped out of his truck. "Dude," he said, shaking his head. "What the hell happened?" "Margaret," I muttered. Chris winced. "Figures. What's the damage?" I gestured helplessly at the mess. Cemented-in car, ruined driveway, a brand new HOA I never signed up for, and Margaret's completely untouched because she's somehow convinced half the neighborhood that she's the queen of the suburbs. Chris crossed his arms and studied the driveway for a moment. "All right," he said. "You know what this means, right?" I looked at him, already knowing exactly where this was going. "Revenge," he said, his grin widening. I exhaled slowly. "It has to be perfect. Of course, it has to hit her where it hurts. Obviously, and it has to be completely untraceable." Chris's grin turned downright sinister. Buddy, I've been waiting for this moment my entire life. We sat in silence for a moment, letting the weight of our mission sink in. Then Chris leaned in and whispered, "So, how do you feel about sand?" I frowned. "Sand?" He nodded. "Margaret loves that stupid SUV of hers, right? The one she spent half a year bragging about." I felt something dark and vengeful stir in my chest. "Go on." "Well," Chris said, "I happen to know that dumping sand in a gas tank is a surefire way to kill an engine. And not just kill it, completely destroy it from the inside out. New car, expensive repairs, months of stress." I let the thought marinate. It was perfect. Poetic, even. She had poured cement on my property, so I'd pour something just as destructive into hers. A fair trade. "Let's do it," I said. Chris clapped his hands together. "Oh, this is going to be fun." I looked back at my cement-covered driveway, my anger still simmering beneath the surface. But for the first time all day, a small smirk tugged at the corner of my lips. Margaret had started this war. Now it was my turn to finish it. Revenge, when done right, is an art. It requires patience, precision, and above all, the perfect moment. Margaret had made her move, completely blindsiding me with her cement stunt. But now it was my turn to strike back, and this wasn't going to be some petty little prank. No, this had to be something she would never forget, something that would send her spiraling into the depths of frustration, just as I had been when I walked outside that morning and saw my car buried in concrete. Chris and I sat in my garage, the door partially open to let in the cool night air. Between us, a single bag of sand sat on the workbench, looking completely innocent to the untrained eye. But we both knew the kind of destruction it was capable of. A handful of sand could destroy an engine. A full bag? That was something Margaret's expensive luxury SUV wouldn't recover from. "This is going to be legendary," Chris muttered, his eyes gleaming as he ran his fingers along the bag. "She won't even see it coming." I exhaled, running through the plan in my head. "We have to be careful. She's got security cameras all over her property, not to mention that little rat dog of hers. That thing barks at shadows." Chris rolled his eyes. "Mr. Pom-Pom, please. That dog couldn't scare a stuffed animal." "Yeah, but if he wakes her up, we're screwed." Chris tapped his chin, then grinned. "I've got an idea." That was never a comforting thing to hear from Chris. An hour later, we were crouched in the shadows at the edge of Margaret's driveway, a handful of treats in my pocket and a bag of sand in Chris's hands. The neighborhood was completely silent, save for the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The perfect time to strike. I inched forward, my heart pounding in my chest as I reached into my pocket and pulled out a dog treat. Mr. Pom-Pom, the tiny terror, was curled up in his little dog bed on the porch, his ears twitching as he slept. I tossed the treat a few feet away, watching as it landed with a soft thud on the pavement. Nothing. I tossed another one, this time a little closer. Mr. Pom-Pom's nose twitched, his eyes fluttering open. He sniffed the air, perked up, then waddled toward the treat. Perfect. With the little distraction in place, Chris crept toward the SUV, moving like a shadow. He pulled a small funnel from his pocket and carefully inserted it into the gas tank. Then, with steady hands, he began pouring the sand. I held my breath, watching as the fine grains disappeared into the tank, knowing that every single particle was sealing Margaret's fate. It was beautiful, in a way. Then, suddenly, the porch light flicked on. Chris froze. I ducked behind a bush, my heart hammering. Margaret's front door swung open, and she stepped out in her bathrobe, a cup of tea in her hand. She yawned, rubbing her eyes as she looked around. Chris was completely exposed. If she turned her head even slightly, she'd see him. My brain went into overdrive. Without thinking, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the last dog treat. Then, with all the grace of a desperate man on the verge of disaster, I chucked it straight at Mr. Pom-Pom. It hit him square in the nose. The little dog yelped, spun in a circle, and then, for reasons I would never understand, took off running in the opposite direction, straight into Margaret's legs. She let out a shriek, stumbling back and nearly spilling her tea all over herself. Mr. Pom-Pom, what is wrong with you? Chris took his chance. With the precision of a trained ninja, he yanked the funnel out of the gas tank, screwed the cap back on, and dove behind the nearest bush just as Margaret turned around. She squinted into the darkness, her face scrunched in suspicion. I held my breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she shook her head and muttered, "Stupid dog," before turning and stomping back into her house. The second the door shut, Chris let out a breath of relief. "That," he whispered, "was way too close." I nodded. "But we did it." Chris grinned. "Oh, we definitely did it." The next morning, Margaret emerged from her house with her usual flair, dressed in designer sunglasses and carrying a purse that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. She strutted toward her SUV, completely unaware of the fate that awaited her. Chris and I watched from my porch, pretending to sip our coffee while we waited. Margaret slid into the driver's seat, adjusted her mirror, and turned the key. At first, the car sputtered. Then it made a horrible grinding sound, like metal on metal. Margaret frowned, twisting the key again. The engine let out one final pained wheeze before completely giving out. A moment of silence. Then, "What the hell?" Margaret screeched, slamming her hands against the steering wheel. She tried again and again, her frustration mounting with every failed attempt. Chris nudged me. "She's going to blow a gasket." As if on cue, Margaret exploded out of the car, kicking the tire like it had personally wronged her. "You have got to be kidding me," she shrieked. "I just bought this car. I spent 40 grand on this car." Chris coughed into his hand to muffle his laughter. Margaret, in full meltdown mode, whipped out her phone and furiously dialed a number. "Yes, hello? I need a tow truck." "No, I don't know what's wrong. It won't start." "I don't care, just get here now." An hour later, a tow truck arrived, and Margaret stood off to the side, arms crossed, tapping her foot impatiently. The mechanic took one look under the hood and let out a long whistle. "Well, ma'am," he said, scratching the back of his neck, "I hate to break it to you, but it looks like someone poured a whole lot of sand into your gas tank." Margaret's face turned an impossible shade of red. "What? Yeah, that's going to destroy your engine. Pretty much unfixable. You'll need a new one." Margaret let out a strangled noise that sounded part scream, part sob. Who would do this?" Chris and I exchanged a glance. "Oh, I don't know," she seethed, turning in a circle as if the culprit would just be standing there. "I bet it was one of my jealous neighbors. They hate me. They all hate me." Chris leaned over and whispered, "Well, at least she got that part right." Margaret stormed into her house, ranting loudly to no one in particular as the tow truck drove away, taking her precious SUV with it. I leaned back in my chair and stretched. Chris clinked his coffee cup against mine. "Sweet, sweet revenge," I smirked. And just like that, the war had officially begun. Margaret was unraveling, and it was a beautiful sight to behold. For the first time in what felt like forever, the smugness had vanished from her face, replaced by sheer, unfiltered rage. Her luxury SUV was gone, towed away like an abandoned relic, and she had no one to blame but herself. Of course, that didn't stop her from trying. She marched up and down the street that afternoon, knocking on doors, demanding to know who had sabotaged her car. She even cornered old Mr. Thompson, the sweet retired history teacher who wouldn't hurt a fly, and accused him of orchestrating some grand revenge scheme. He just blinked at her, adjusted his hearing aid, and shut the door in her face. Chris and I sat on my porch, pretending to be deeply engrossed in a conversation about my ruined driveway every time Margaret glanced in our direction. But she knew. She couldn't prove it, but she knew. The only thing keeping her from outright accusing me was the complete lack of evidence, and that was the best part. She was powerless, just like I had been when I walked out that morning to find my car buried in cement. By the time evening rolled around, Margaret had resorted to pacing in her front yard, barking into her phone at some poor customer service representative from her insurance company. It didn't take a genius to figure out that she was being told the worst news imaginable. "What do you mean it's not covered?" she screeched, throwing one hand in the air. "This is vandalism. Someone attacked my vehicle. That's what insurance is for." A pause. "What do you mean it's my fault?" Chris nearly choked on his soda, turning away to hide his laughter. I had to bite my cheek to keep from grinning. Margaret's face turned a deeper shade of red as she listened to whatever response she was getting on the other end. Then, with a scream of frustration, she threw her phone at the ground. It bounced off the pavement, landing face down in the grass. For a long moment, she just stood there, breathing heavily, fists clenched at her sides. And then, as if she had just made the most important decision of her life, she turned and stormed back into her house. Chris nudged me. Oh, she's plotting. I nodded. Let her. Whatever she comes up with, it won't be enough. That was what I thought. But Margaret had one last card to play. The next morning, the entire neighborhood received an urgent email. It was from Margaret, of course, written in her usual condescending tone. She was calling for an emergency HOA meeting. Chris and I read it at the same time, then exchanged a look. She's about to go nuclear, Chris said. Let her, I replied. That evening, the so-called emergency meeting was held in Margaret's backyard. It was the first time I had been on her property, and I had to admit, it was impressive. Perfectly manicured hedges, a massive patio, a pool that probably cost more than my entire house. Too bad the person who owned it was an absolute nightmare. Margaret stood at the front, arms crossed, looking like a general about to declare war. The neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering amongst themselves. Some looked annoyed at being dragged into this nonsense, while others, like Mrs. Hernandez, who had been fighting with Margaret over a property line dispute for years, looked downright amused. Once everyone had arrived, Margaret cleared her throat and began. We have a criminal in our midst, she announced, her voice dripping with self-importance. Someone in this neighborhood, someone standing here right now, committed an act of vandalism against my property. A few people exchanged glances. No one spoke. Margaret continued. This wasn't just a prank. This was an attack. My vehicle was sabotaged. My personal property was destroyed. And do you know what I've realized? She paused dramatically, sweeping her gaze over the crowd. No one here respects the rules. A groan rippled through the crowd. Oh, here we go, Mrs. Hernandez muttered. Margaret ignored her. This is exactly why I started the HOA. This community needs structure. It needs order. And it needs leaders like me to enforce it. Chris leaned toward me and whispered, She's really out here trying to turn herself into a dictator. I smirked. Margaret took a deep breath, then pointed a perfectly manicured finger at me. And it all started with him. I raised an eyebrow. Me? Yes, you, she snapped. You think I don't know? First, you disrespect the neighborhood with your illegal driveway renovations. Then, suddenly, my car is sabotaged. What a coincidence. I crossed my arms. You're the one who poured cement on my property. That was different, she huffed. That was an act of community preservation. A few neighbors snorted. Margaret's eye twitched. That's not the point, she said. The point is, I'm proposing new regulations, effective immediately. All renovations, property changes, and personal disputes must go through me. I will personally approve or deny them. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Then someone laughed. At first, I thought it was Chris, but then I realized it was coming from the back of the crowd. Margaret's own husband. He shook his head, arms crossed, a bemused expression on his face. Margaret, he said, his voice laced with exhaustion, you can't be serious. Margaret turned to him, shocked. Excuse me. You're taking this too far, he continued. This whole thing, it's ridiculous. You can't control the entire neighborhood. Margaret's mouth opened and closed. I'm not trying to control it. I'm trying to help it. He sighed. You poured cement on someone's driveway. You declared yourself head of an HOA that no one agreed to. And now you want complete power over what people do with their own homes. Do you even hear yourself? Margaret's face crumpled. I'm just trying to keep things perfect. But they don't have to be perfect, he said. They just have to be livable. For the first time since I had known her, Margaret looked small. The fight had drained out of her. She glanced around at the neighbors, searching for support, but no one was on her side. One by one, they started to leave. Margaret stood there, watching her kingdom fall apart. Her husband shook his head one last time, then turned to me. I'll pay for the driveway, he said. I should have stopped her sooner. I nodded. Appreciated. And just like that, the war was over. Margaret's reign had ended. The next day, a moving truck appeared in front of Margaret's house. By the end of the week, she was gone. For the first time in months, the neighborhood was peaceful. I sat on my porch, watching as a new family moved into Margaret's old house. A woman stepped out, surveying her new surroundings, then turned and yelled at the moving crew, demanding they be more careful with her expensive furniture. Chris sat beside me, sipping his drink. He followed my gaze, then sighed. Oh no. I exhaled. Here we go again.